Teachers, what did you discover about a student that shut down an entire school district? I found the journal during lunch duty on a Thursday in March. One of my 8th graders, Sophia Mendez, had left her backpack unzipped on the cafeteria table when she went to throw away her tray. A blue notebook slid out and fell open on the floor. I picked it up to close it and saw my own name written in her handwriting at the top of the page. Mr. Lawson doesn't know what Principal Vance does in his office after school. None of them know, but I know because I have to go there 3 times a week for extra help. Except, it's not extra help. It's something else. Something wrong. I want to tell someone, but who would believe me? Principal Vance is friends with the superintendent. He gives speeches at school board meetings. Everyone loves him. I'm just a kid who gets bad grades. My hands went cold. I read the entry again to make sure I understood what I was seeing. The words were clear and specific. Sophia described being called to the principal's office under the pretense of academic tutoring. She described Principal Vance locking the door. She described him touching her in ways that made her uncomfortable. She described this happening multiple times over several months. She wrote that she'd tried to avoid going, but he'd threatened to fail her out of 8th grade if she didn't show up. My stomach turned. I looked up and saw Sophia coming back to the table. She saw the notebook in my hands, and her face went white. She grabbed it from me without saying anything and shoved it back in her bag. Then she walked out of the cafeteria fast, almost running. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what I'd just read. Every instinct told me this was real. Sophia's fear when she saw me holding the journal wasn't the reaction of someone who'd made something up. That was genuine terror. I needed to report this immediately, but I also knew how these things worked. Accusations against administrators rarely went anywhere, especially when the administrator was as connected as Principal Vance. He'd been at Lincoln Middle School for 12 years. He was respected throughout the district. The superintendent considered him a mentor. If I reported this and it turned out to be a misunderstanding somehow, my career would be over. But if I didn't report it and Sophia was telling the truth, I'd be complicit in ongoing abuse. There wasn't really a choice. I left the cafeteria and went straight to the counselor's office. Rachel Kimura had been the school counselor for 6 years, and I trusted her more than anyone else on staff. She was in her office eating a sandwich and looked up when I knocked on her open door. "Can I talk to you? It's urgent." Rachel set down her sandwich and gestured for me to close the door. I sat across from her desk and explained what had happened with Sophia's journal. Rachel's expression changed from curious to horrified as I described what I'd read. "You need to file a report with Child Protective Services immediately, like right now. This can't wait." Rachel pulled up the CPS hotline number on her computer and wrote it down for me. "I'll document that you came to me with this information so there's a record, but you need to be the one to make the call since you're the one who saw the journal." I called CPS from Rachel's office and spent 20 minutes on the phone with an intake specialist, explaining what I'd read in Sophia's journal. The specialist asked detailed questions about what the entries said, when they were dated, whether I'd observed any concerning behavior from Sophia or Principal Vance. I answered everything as accurately as I could remember. The specialist said she'd open an investigation immediately, and someone would be in contact with the school within 24 hours. She also said I was required to report this information to the school district's Human Resources Department since the accused was a district employee. I hung up and looked at Rachel. "HR next?" Rachel nodded. "Better to get ahead of it. If Vance finds out you reported him through the grapevine before you've talked to HR, he could claim you went around proper channels and tried to damage his reputation." I called the district HR office and explained the situation to the director, a woman named Gloria Reeves, who I'd only met once at a new teacher orientation years ago. Gloria listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she said she'd need to see the journal entries herself and would be sending someone to the school immediately to interview me and hopefully interview Sophia as well. Gloria asked if Principal Vance was aware of the situation yet. I said no. She said to keep it that way until their investigator arrived. She said, under no circumstances should I discuss this with anyone except her office and the counselor. Then she hung up. Rachel looked at me with concern. "How are you doing?" I realized my hands were shaking. I just accused our principal of sexually abusing a student based on reading a few pages of her private journal. If this is real, it's the worst thing I've ever encountered. If it's somehow not real, I just destroyed a man's career and my own. Rachel shook her head. You did the right thing. You're a mandatory reporter. You saw evidence of abuse and you reported it. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. Whatever happens next isn't on you, but it felt like it was on me. I was the one who'd read the journal. I was the one making the accusations. If this went sideways, I'd be the target. The district investigator arrived 90 minutes later. Her name was Patricia Oleander, and she looked like she'd been doing this job for decades. She had tired eyes and carried herself with the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much institutional failure. She interviewed me in Rachel's office with Rachel present. She asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen in the journal, what made me pick it up, what Sophia's reaction had been when she saw me holding it. I went through everything step by step, trying to be precise and factual. Patricia took notes on a tablet the entire time I spoke. When I finished, she asked if I'd noticed any changes in Sophia's behavior over the school year. I thought about it. Sophia had always been quiet, but she'd become more withdrawn in recent months. Her grades had dropped from C's to D's and F's. She ate lunch alone most days. She looked tired constantly, like she wasn't sleeping well. I told Patricia all of this. Patricia asked if I knew whether Sophia had friends she might have confided in. I said I'd seen her talking to another girl in my class occasionally, a student named Leah Burton. Patricia wrote that down. She asked if Principal Vance had exhibited any concerning behavior that I'd witnessed personally. I said no. He'd always been professional in my interactions with him. Friendly, supportive, the kind of principal who knew students' names and showed up to their games and concerts. That's what made this so disturbing. If Sophia's journal was accurate, Vance had successfully presented one face to the world while doing something horrific in private. Patricia closed her tablet and looked at me directly. I'm going to need to interview Sophia before the end of the school day. Can you tell me what class she has next? I checked the schedule. Sophia had my English class 6th period right after lunch. Patricia said she'd pull Sophia from class and conduct the interview in the conference room adjacent to Rachel's office. She asked me to send Sophia to Rachel when she arrived for 6th period. The rest of lunch duty felt surreal. I stood in the cafeteria watching students eat and talk and laugh, aware that somewhere in this building a girl was being abused by the person who was supposed to protect her. When the bell rang, students filed out toward their next classes. I walked back to my classroom and tried to prepare for 6th period, but I couldn't focus on the lesson plan. Sophia arrived 3 minutes after the bell, which was unusual because she was normally punctual. She took her seat in the back corner without making eye contact with me or anyone else. I let the class work on their assigned reading for 5 minutes before calling Sophia to my desk quietly. Ms. Kimura needs to see you in her office. Take your things with you. Sophia's face went white again. Why? What did I do? Nothing. She just needs to talk to you about something. Sophia packed up her bag slowly and left the classroom. I watched her go and felt sick. The next 2 hours were the longest of my teaching career. I went through the motions of teaching 6th and 7th period, but my mind was entirely focused on what was happening in that conference room. Was Sophia telling Patricia everything? Was she denying it all out of fear? Was Patricia skilled enough to get through to a traumatized 14-year-old who'd been threatened into silence? When the final bell rang and students flooded out of the building, I stayed at my desk pretending to grade papers while actually staring at my computer screen without seeing it. Rachel appeared in my doorway around 4 o'clock. She looked exhausted. Can you come to the conference room? Patricia wants to talk to you. I followed Rachel to the conference room where Patricia sat with her tablet and a stack of papers. She gestured for me to sit. I interviewed Sophia for 2 hours. She confirmed everything you saw in her journal and provided additional details. This is an active abuse situation that's been ongoing since October. Sophia was initially called to Principal Vance's office for legitimate academic support, but the sessions became inappropriate within a few weeks. Vance has been grooming her systematically. He isolated her from peers, convinced her nobody would believe her if she told, and threatened her academic standing if she stopped coming to the sessions. Patricia's voice was clinical and detached, but I could see anger in her eyes. Sophia mentioned in her interview that Vance told her about other students he'd helped in similar ways. She didn't have names, but the implication was that she's not the first victim. My stomach dropped. You think there are others? Patricia nodded. Based on Sophia's statement and Vance's position of authority over a large student population for 12 years, it would be unusual if she was the only one. We'll be investigating that possibility thoroughly. She slid a document across the table. This is your formal statement. Review it, sign it if accurate, and return it to me before you leave today. Principal Vance will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. He's being notified right now by Gloria and a district security officer. I read through the statement, signed it, and handed it back. What happens next? Patricia stood and gathered her materials. Child Protective Services will interview Sophia tomorrow. The police will likely be involved because Vance's actions constitute criminal sexual abuse of a minor. The district will conduct a parallel investigation into whether any other staff members knew about this or should have noticed warning signs. Your role is done for now. Go home, don't discuss this with anyone, and be prepared to be interviewed again as the investigation progresses. She left, and I sat alone in the conference room, trying to process everything. I'd come to work this morning thinking about lesson plans and grading essays. Now I was sitting in the aftermath of what would probably become the biggest scandal in our district's history. I drove home in a daze and spent the evening unable to eat or focus on anything. My wife knew something was wrong, but I couldn't tell her details because of confidentiality requirements. I just said there was a situation at school involving a student and an administrator, and I couldn't talk about it yet. She hugged me and said, I looked like I needed to sleep. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sophia's face when she grabbed her journal from my hands. That look of pure terror. The next morning, I arrived at school to find Principal Vance's office dark and empty. An email had gone out to staff overnight from the superintendent, stating that Vance was on administrative leave for personal reasons, and the assistant principal would be serving as interim principal until further notice. The assistant principal, Dennis Kowalski, called an emergency staff meeting before first period. 30 teachers crammed into the library looking confused and concerned. Dennis stood at the front, looking uncomfortable. I know you all received the email about Principal Vance. I can't provide details about the situation due to personnel privacy and an ongoing investigation. What I can tell you is that if any of you are approached by investigators and asked questions about students or administrative practices, you're required to cooperate fully and honestly. Don't speculate, don't gossip, just answer questions truthfully if asked. Someone raised their hand. Is Vance coming back? Dennis hesitated. I don't have that information at this time. My job right now is to keep this school running smoothly while the situation is resolved. If you have questions, direct them to me or to the district office. Now let's get to our classrooms and have a normal day for our students. But it wasn't a normal day. Students had seen Vance's dark office. Rumors were already flying through the hallways. By lunch, half the school was convinced Vance had been arrested. The other half thought he'd quit suddenly. Nobody knew the truth yet, but they sensed something significant had happened. I avoided the cafeteria during lunch duty and stayed in my classroom. I didn't want to risk running into Sophia and making her uncomfortable. Around 1 o'clock, Dennis appeared at my door. The police are here. They want to talk to you. I followed Dennis to the conference room where 2 detectives were waiting. The woman introduced herself as Detective Alicia Brennan and her partner as Detective Ryan Cho. They asked me to sit and explain everything I'd seen in Sophia's journal and everything that had happened afterward. I went through the timeline again, trying to remember every detail. Detective Brennan took notes in a small notebook, while Detective Cho recorded the conversation on his phone after getting my consent. When I finished, Detective Brennan asked if I'd ever witnessed Principal Vance alone with students in his office with the door closed. I said yes, frequently. He regularly met with students for academic or disciplinary reasons. That was part of his job. She asked if I'd ever noticed him showing preferential treatment to certain students or acting inappropriately. I said no. Everything I'd seen had appeared professional and normal. Detective Cho asked if other staff members had mentioned anything about Vance that seemed concerning. I said no. Vance was well liked by staff. He was supportive of teachers, backed us up with difficult parents, and generally created a positive work environment. The detectives exchanged a look. Detective Brennan closed her notebook. That's consistent with what we're hearing from other staff. Vance presented himself as an exemplary principal while allegedly abusing students in private. The compartmentalization is common in these cases. Offenders often build sterling public reputations specifically to insulate themselves from suspicion. She stood up. We'll be interviewing all staff and many students over the next several days. If you remember anything else relevant, contact me directly." She handed me her card. I went back to my classroom feeling hollowed out. The idea that Vance had been doing this for years while maintaining a perfect professional facade made me question my own judgment. I'd liked working for him. I'd thought he cared about students. How had I missed this? How had we all missed this? After school, Rachel found me packing up my classroom. "You doing okay?" I shook my head. I keep thinking about all the times I saw students go into Vance's office. What if some of them were victims and I just didn't realize? Rachel sat on one of the student desks. "You can't think like that. Predators are experts at hiding what they do. That's how they get away with it for so long. The important thing is that you acted immediately when you saw evidence. That probably saved Sophia from months or years of additional abuse." Her words helped, but guilt still gnawed at me. That night the story broke publicly. A local news station ran a report that Principal Vance of Lincoln Middle School had been placed on administrative leave amid an investigation into allegations of inappropriate conduct with a student. The report didn't name Sophia or provide details, but it confirmed that police were involved and the matter was being taken seriously. My phone started buzzing with texts from other teachers asking if I knew what was happening. I didn't respond to any of them. The next day, Friday, was chaos. News vans were parked outside the school. Reporters tried to interview students and parents as they arrived. The district sent additional security to keep media off school property. Inside, students buzzed with rumors and speculation. Teachers tried to maintain normal lessons, but nobody's head was in it. During my planning period, I was called to Dennis's office. When I arrived, Gloria Reeves from District HR was there along with the superintendent, Dr. Leonard Foster. Dr. Foster was in his 60s, tall and distinguished-looking with silver hair. He'd been superintendent for 8 years and was generally respected, though distant. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. "Mr. Lawson, I want to personally thank you for reporting what you observed. Your actions may have prevented further harm to students and allowed us to address a serious situation." His tone was formal and rehearsed. Gloria spoke next. "As the investigation continues, you may be contacted by media. I want to be clear. You are not to speak to reporters under any circumstances. All media inquiries should be directed to the district communications office. Violating this directive could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination." Dr. Foster added, "We're trying to protect student privacy and the integrity of the investigation. The last thing we need is teachers giving interviews that could compromise the case or identify victims." I nodded. "I understand. I have no intention of talking to the media." Dr. Foster studied me for a moment. "I also want to prepare you for the possibility that this situation may become more complicated. If Sophia's allegations are substantiated, and if there are other victims as investigators suspect, this could become a major scandal. There will be questions about district oversight, about how this was allowed to happen, about who should have known. Some of those questions may be directed at you as the teacher who discovered the abuse." I felt my defenses rise. "Are you suggesting I'm somehow responsible for not catching this sooner?" Gloria held up a hand. "Nobody's suggesting that. Dr. Foster is simply making you aware that in high-profile cases like this, everyone involved gets scrutinized. Parents will want to know how a principal could abuse students for potentially years without anyone noticing. We need to be prepared for that scrutiny and have clear answers." Dr. Foster leaned forward. "Tell me honestly, in your 3 years working under Principal Vance, did you ever see anything that should have raised red flags? Any behavior that seemed off?" I thought carefully before answering. "No, nothing. Vance was professional in every interaction I observed. He was good at his job. He connected with students and staff. If there were warning signs, they weren't visible to me or to anyone else I've talked to." Dr. Foster sat back, looking dissatisfied with that answer but unable to challenge it. "All right, thank you for your time. Remember, no media contact." I left his office feeling like I'd just been warned about something without being told exactly what I was being warned about. Over the weekend, more information leaked to the press. On Saturday, a news report revealed that police had obtained search warrants for Principal Vance's home, office, and electronic devices. On Sunday, another report stated that investigators were looking into whether there were additional victims beyond the initial complainant. The district issued a statement calling the allegations deeply disturbing and promising full cooperation with law enforcement. They announced that a crisis counseling team would be available at Lincoln Middle School the following week for any students who needed support. Monday morning, I arrived early to find the school surrounded by even more media than Friday. Parents were being interviewed in the parking lot. Some defended Vance and claimed this was all a misunderstanding. Others demanded to know how the district could have let this happen. Security kept reporters away from the building entrance, but the scene was chaotic. Inside, the crisis counseling team had set up in the library. A dozen counselors from around the district were available to talk with students. Dennis had sent out an email over the weekend instructing teachers to be alert for students who seemed distressed and to send them to the library if needed. My first period class was subdued. Students kept glancing at each other and whispering. Finally, one girl raised her hand. "Mr. Lawson, is it true that Principal Vance did something bad to a student?" I'd been expecting this question, but still wasn't sure how to answer it. "There's an investigation happening. I can't discuss details, but if you're feeling worried or confused about what you're hearing, the counselors in the library are here to help." Another student spoke up. "My mom said he's a predator. She said other kids might have been hurt too and they should come forward." I kept my voice calm and measured. The most important thing is that if anyone feels unsafe or uncomfortable about anything happening at school, they should talk to a trusted adult. That could be a teacher, a counselor, a parent, or the police. Everyone here wants you to be safe. The conversation was delicate, and I could feel myself walking a tightrope between acknowledging the situation and not revealing confidential information. We moved on to the lesson, but the tension remained. During my planning period, Rachel came to my classroom looking shaken. 3 more students came forward this morning. They told the counselors that Vance did the same thing to them that he did to Sophia. The counselors reported it to CPS and police immediately. I felt sick. "How many victims are there?" Rachel shook her head. "Nobody knows yet. The detectives are interviewing students one by one. They're focusing on girls who had regular meetings with Vance in his office. It's looking like a pattern of behavior going back years." She sat down at one of the student desks. "Parents are losing their minds. The phone system is overwhelmed with calls demanding answers. Some parents are pulling their kids out of school. Others are organizing a meeting to demand accountability from the district." I asked when the parent meeting was happening. Rachel said it was scheduled for Wednesday evening in the school auditorium. The superintendent and school board members would be there to address concerns. Wednesday's parent meeting was packed. The auditorium seated 400, but at least 500 people showed up. Parents stood along the walls and in the aisles. The energy in the room was angry and afraid. Dr. Foster stood at a podium on stage with school board president Miranda Valdez beside him. The 5 other board members sat in chairs behind them. Dr. Foster tried to start the meeting but was immediately shouted down by parents demanding to know how many victims there were and why Vance hadn't been stopped sooner. He held up his hands for quiet. "I understand your anger and fear. As a parent myself, I would feel exactly the same way. What I can tell you is that the investigation is ongoing. As of today, detectives have identified 6 students who have made allegations against former Principal Vance. We don't know if there are additional victims. Police are conducting interviews and following every lead." A woman stood up in the middle of the auditorium. 6 children. 6. And you expect us to believe nobody noticed anything? How is that possible? Dr. Foster's response was careful. Principal Vance was a trusted administrator with 12 years of exemplary service. He presented himself professionally and had strong relationships with students and staff. Predators often hide in plain sight by building exactly this kind of reputation. When the abuse was finally reported by a teacher who observed evidence, the district acted immediately. Another parent shouted from the back. "Which teacher? We have a right to know who reported this." Miranda Valdez spoke for the first time. "We cannot reveal the identity of the reporting teacher due to confidentiality and safety concerns. What matters is that when evidence of abuse was discovered, it was reported to authorities within hours. The system worked in that regard." But parents weren't satisfied. The meeting devolved into chaos, with multiple people shouting questions and accusations simultaneously. School board members tried to respond but couldn't get control of the room. Finally, Dr. Foster announced that written questions could be submitted to the district office, and responses would be provided as the investigation allowed. The meeting ended with parents furious and demanding more transparency. I watched from the back of the auditorium, grateful my identity as the reporting teacher hadn't been made public. But I knew that wouldn't last. Small communities had ways of finding out information. Sure enough, by Thursday morning, my name was circulating. I don't know who leaked it or how they found out, but suddenly other teachers were looking at me differently. Some with respect, others with something that looked like resentment. At lunch, another 8th grade teacher named Philip Grant approached me in the faculty lounge. "So you're the one who reported Vance." His tone wasn't friendly. I nodded, not sure where this was going. Philip crossed his arms. "You know, you probably destroyed an innocent man's career, right? 6 accusations doesn't mean 6 truths. Kids lie. They get ideas in their heads. Once one person makes an accusation, others pile on because they want attention." I felt anger rising. I read detailed accounts of abuse in a student's private journal. That's not a lie or attention-seeking. That's a cry for help. Philip shook his head. Or it's an angry kid with a grudge making up stories. Did you ever consider that? Did you think about the consequences of reporting something you read in a journal without any actual evidence? Another teacher, Angela Morrison, spoke up from across the room. "Wait, I'm confused. Are you saying we shouldn't report suspected abuse because the accused might be innocent? That's literally the opposite of our legal responsibility as mandatory reporters." Philip turned to her. "I'm saying we should use judgment. Vance was a good principal. He cared about this school, and now his reputation is destroyed based on accusations from teenagers." Angela stood up. 6 teenagers. 6 separate victims who don't know each other and who reported consistent patterns of abuse. That's not a conspiracy. That's corroboration. The argument escalated until Rachel walked in and told everyone to stop. "This isn't productive. There's an investigation happening. Let it play out. Fighting among ourselves helps nobody." But the damage was done. The faculty was divided. Some teachers supported me and believed the students. Others thought I'd acted rashly and destroyed Vance's career over unsubstantiated claims. The division made the school environment toxic. Students sensed the tension among staff, and it made them more anxious. On Friday, Detective Brennan came back to interview me again. This time, she had more specific questions. "Did Principal Vance ever discuss his personal life with you? Did he mention struggles at home, financial problems, anything that might suggest stressors?" I thought about it. Not really. He mentioned his wife occasionally, but nothing that stood out. He seemed to have a normal family life. Detective Brennan made a note. "We're building a psychological profile. Vance presents as a classic grooming offender. Charismatic, trusted authority figure, calculated in victim selection. He targeted girls who were struggling academically or socially, girls who were more vulnerable and less likely to be believed." She looked up from her notes. "The 6 victims we've identified so far all fit that pattern. Sophia has learning disabilities and poor grades. Another girl is from a low-income family and wears donated clothes. Another has an unstable home life with a single parent who works multiple jobs. Vance specifically chose victims who lacked strong support systems." I felt nauseated. He was strategic about it. Detective Brennan nodded. "Very. We're also looking at his electronic devices. Forensics found deleted files on his personal computer at home. Thousands of images. Some of them appear to be of students in compromising positions, though we're still working to identify individuals. It looks like Vance was documenting his abuse." My hands clenched. "He was taking pictures?" Detective Brennan's expression was grim. "And videos. We're working with the FBI now, because if he distributed any of this material, it becomes a federal case involving child exploitation. The scope keeps expanding." She stood to leave. "One more thing. We found a ledger in Vance's home office. It appears to be a log of sessions with students going back 8 years. Names, dates, notes about each encounter. We're cross-referencing it with school schedules and records. The number of victims could be significantly higher than 6. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room trying to comprehend what she'd told me. Vance hadn't just been abusing students opportunistically. He'd been running a systematic operation, selecting victims carefully, documenting everything, potentially for years, and none of us had noticed. That evening, the news broke about the expanded investigation and FBI involvement. The story went national. Lincoln Middle School in suburban Connecticut became a headline. Beloved principal accused of years-long abuse of students. My phone exploded with messages from friends and family who'd seen the coverage. They wanted to know if I was okay, if I'd been involved, if I knew details. I couldn't answer any of it. The district's gag order was still in effect. Over the weekend, 3 more victims came forward, then 2 more. By Monday morning, the count was up to 11 confirmed victims, with detectives still working through Vance's ledger. The FBI held a press conference confirming that they'd found evidence suggesting Vance may have been part of a larger network of offenders who traded images and videos of children. The press conference was carried live on national news. FBI Special Agent Catherine Delacroix stood at a podium and explained that the investigation had expanded beyond Vance himself. We have evidence suggesting that Mr. Vance was communicating with other individuals who share his criminal interests. We're pursuing leads in multiple states. Anyone with information about Mr. Vance's activities or associates should contact the FBI immediately. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Parents pulled their children out of Lincoln Middle School in droves. Enrollment dropped by 30% in a week. The school board held an emergency meeting and announced that Lincoln Middle School would be closed for the remainder of the school year. Students would be redistributed to other middle schools in the district. Teachers would be reassigned or placed on paid leave depending on need. I received notice that I was being reassigned to Monroe Middle School across town, starting immediately. Rachel was being reassigned too, along with about half of Lincoln's staff. The other half would be on paid leave until positions opened up. The closure was presented as a way to give students a fresh start away from the location of their trauma, but everyone knew it was really about damage control. The district couldn't handle the media circus and parent backlash. Closing the school was easier than trying to rehabilitate its reputation. My last day at Lincoln was surreal. I packed up my classroom while students weren't there, boxing up books and supplies and personal items. The halls were empty and echoing. Other teachers were doing the same thing, packing up rooms they'd worked in for years. Some were crying, others just looked numb. Dennis found me in my classroom that afternoon. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 weeks. This is a nightmare. I keep thinking I should have seen something, noticed something. I worked alongside Vance for 7 years. How did I miss it? I didn't have an answer because I'd been asking myself the same question. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then Dennis said, "For what it's worth, you did the right thing, reporting what you saw. I know some people are giving you grief about it, but you saved kids from further abuse. That matters more than anything else." He left, and I finished packing. When I loaded the last box into my car and drove away from Lincoln Middle School, I felt like I was leaving a crime scene. Monroe Middle School was different, larger, newer, with a different culture. The principal there, Vanessa Ortega, was warm but clearly overwhelmed by the sudden influx of new staff and students. She held a meeting with those of us coming from Lincoln and explained that she understood this was difficult for everyone. You're not responsible for what happened at your previous school. You're here now, and we're going to move forward together. If anyone gives you trouble or treats you differently because of the Lincoln situation, report it to me immediately. But students and staff at Monroe did treat us differently. Some were supportive. Others kept their distance like we were contaminated. Lincoln had become synonymous with institutional failure and abuse. Being associated with it carried a stigma. I tried to focus on teaching and building relationships with my new students, but it was hard. Every interaction felt weighted by what had happened. Parents at Monroe were nervous about having Lincoln staff at their school. Some sent emails to Vanessa demanding reassurance that all of us had been thoroughly vetted and investigated. The district sent out a statement confirming that every staff member from Lincoln had been interviewed by police and cleared of any wrongdoing or knowledge of abuse. But that didn't satisfy everyone. 3 weeks after the closure of Lincoln, Detective Brennan called me at home. "We've made an arrest in addition to Vance. Another person connected to the abuse network." I asked who. Detective Brennan said, "Rebecca Nolan. She was the administrative assistant at Lincoln. Worked directly under Vance." My stomach dropped. I knew Rebecca. She'd been at Lincoln the entire time I'd worked there. She was efficient, friendly, always had candy on her desk for students. What did she do? Detective Brennan's voice was hard. She facilitated access. She scheduled the so-called tutoring sessions with students. She made sure Vance had uninterrupted time in his office with victims. She redirected other staff members when they tried to approach Vance's office during sessions. And she deleted digital records that might have revealed the pattern of which students were meeting with Vance repeatedly. I felt dizzy. She knew what he was doing? Detective Brennan said, "She absolutely knew. We found emails between them discussing logistics. She even received payments from Vance, likely as compensation for her assistance. She enabled years of abuse by helping him maintain access to victims and covering his tracks. I thought about all the times I'd walked past Rebecca's desk outside Vance's office, all the times she'd smiled and made small talk, all the times she'd told me Vance was busy with a student and couldn't be interrupted. She hadn't just known, she'd been an active participant in the abuse. The revelation made everything worse. Parents who'd been gradually calming down were furious again. The district had cleared staff but failed to catch someone who'd been enabling abuse the entire time. The school board called for an external audit of the district's screening and oversight processes. The audit was conducted by an independent firm over 6 weeks. When the results were released, they were damning. The auditors found that the district had no meaningful oversight of principals' interactions with students. There were no policies requiring that meetings with students be documented or supervised. Principals had essentially unlimited private access to students with minimal accountability. The audit also found that there had been complaints about Vance years earlier that were never properly investigated. A parent had called the district office in 2019 saying her daughter felt uncomfortable around Vance and didn't want to meet with him alone. The complaint was forwarded to Vance himself to address, and he'd dismissed it as a misunderstanding. No independent investigation was conducted. The parent eventually dropped the issue. Another red flag had been raised by a teacher in 2021 who'd noticed that Vance met repeatedly with certain female students behind closed doors. The teacher mentioned it to the assistant principal, Dennis Kowalski, who said Vance was just providing extra support to struggling students. Nothing was documented, and no questions were asked. The audit concluded that the district had systemic failures in student protection. Multiple opportunities to investigate concerns about Vance had been missed due to lack of policy, lack of training, and a culture that deferred to administrators without questioning their authority. The school board held a public meeting to discuss the audit findings. It was even more chaotic than the previous meeting. Parents demanded resignations. They demanded policy changes. They demanded accountability for everyone who'd failed to protect students. Dr. Foster tried to defend the district's response once the abuse was finally reported, but parents weren't interested in hearing about what happened after the fact. They wanted to know why it had been allowed to happen in the first place. Miranda Valdez, the school board president, eventually stood up and took the microphone. The audit findings are unacceptable. Our policies failed, our oversight failed. We failed the students we're supposed to protect. I'm proposing immediate reforms, including mandatory reporting training for all staff, required documentation of all one-on-one meetings between adults and students, and independent oversight of administrator conduct. These measures should have been in place years ago. It's unconscionable that they weren't. She paused, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm also calling for the resignation of Superintendent Foster. The failures identified in the audit occurred under his leadership. He may not have known about Vance's specific actions, but he created and maintained a system that allowed those actions to continue unchecked. That's a leadership failure that warrants accountability. The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Dr. Foster stood at the podium looking shocked. He tried to respond but couldn't be heard over the noise. The school board called for a vote on whether to request Foster's resignation. It passed 5-2. Dr. Foster was given 30 days to resign or face termination proceedings. He chose to resign 2 days later with a prepared statement blaming a few bad actors for the situation and insisting his leadership had always prioritized students. Nobody believed him. The search for a new superintendent took months and became a referendum on the district's culture. The school board hired an interim superintendent, a woman named Dr. Teresa Caldwell, from a neighboring district known for strong student protection policies. She immediately implemented the reforms Miranda had proposed and launched a comprehensive review of all district practices related to student safety. Meanwhile, Vance's criminal case moved forward. He was indicted on 43 counts, including sexual abuse, exploitation of a minor, and distribution of child sexual abuse material. Rebecca Nolan was indicted on 12 counts of being an accessory to abuse and obstruction of justice. Both pleaded not guilty and prepared for trial. The FBI investigation into Vance's network led to arrests in 4 other states. Detectives identified men Vance had been communicating with who had similar positions of authority over children: a youth pastor, a coach, a Boy Scout leader, and another school administrator. All were charged with various offenses related to child exploitation. The scope of the case expanded into one of the largest child abuse investigations in the region's history. By the time everything was documented, Vance had abused at least 19 students over 8 years at Lincoln Middle School. The actual number might have been higher, but some victims never came forward, and some of Vance's records were too cryptic to definitively identify additional students. The psychological damage to victims, their families, and the entire school community was immeasurable. Several families sued the district for negligence. The cases settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, but court documents revealed settlements totaling over $8 million. The district's insurance covered most of it, but taxpayers still bore significant costs. Property values in the Lincoln Middle School attendance zone dropped as families avoided moving into an area associated with the abuse scandal. The closed school building sat empty for a year while the district decided what to do with it. Eventually, they announced it would be demolished and the land sold to offset lawsuit costs. That felt fitting somehow. The building where so much harm had occurred shouldn't continue to exist as a monument to institutional failure. Vance's trial began 14 months after I found Sophia's journal. I was called to testify about discovering the journal and reporting it. The courtroom was packed with media, victims' families, and members of the public. Vance sat at the defense table in a suit, looking nothing like the friendly principal I'd known. His expression was blank and detached, like he was watching something that had nothing to do with him. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Lydia Chang, walked me through my testimony methodically. I described finding the journal, reading the entry, reporting it immediately. I described Sophia's reaction when she saw me holding the journal. I described the fear in her face that told me everything she'd written was true. Vance's defense attorney, a man named Douglas Pierce, tried to shake my testimony during cross-examination. He asked why I'd read a student's private journal. I explained I'd picked it up after it fell and saw my name, making me concerned about what the entry might say. He suggested I'd invaded Sophia's privacy and violated her trust. I responded that mandatory reporting requirements overrode privacy concerns when abuse was suspected. Pierce tried another angle. Did you actually see Principal Vance abuse anyone? No. Did you witness any inappropriate behavior directly? No. So your entire report was based on reading a few sentences in a journal written by a 14-year-old girl? I kept my voice steady. I read detailed descriptions of ongoing abuse. Those descriptions were specific, consistent, and accompanied by genuine fear when the student realized I'd seen them. That was sufficient to meet mandatory reporting requirements. Pierce pushed harder. But you didn't know if those descriptions were accurate, did you? You didn't investigate or verify anything. You just immediately reported an accusation that destroyed a man's career and reputation. Lydia Chang objected before I could answer. The witness is a teacher, not an investigator. Teachers are required by law to report suspected abuse immediately. The defense is criticizing the witness for following legal obligations. The judge sustained the objection. Pierce moved on, but the point had been made for the jury. I'd reported based on limited information. But then, the prosecution called victim after victim to testify. Sophia went first, describing years of abuse in painful detail. Her voice shook, but she answered every question clearly. She described Vance grooming her with special attention, isolating her from peers, gradually escalating physical contact until it became overtly sexual. She described being threatened with academic failure if she told anyone. She described feeling trapped and hopeless, until she started writing in her journal as a way to process what was happening. After Sophia, 10 other victims testified over the course of a week. Each described similar patterns: initial positive attention, gradual isolation, escalating abuse, threats to maintain silence. Their testimonies were consistent and devastating. Several broke down on the stand. Parents cried in the gallery. By the time victim testimony concluded, Vance's detached expression had cracked. He looked pale and sick. The prosecution then presented forensic evidence from Vance's devices, thousands of images and videos documenting abuse, digital communications with other offenders in his network, the ledger where he'd tracked victims and encounters. Every piece of physical evidence corroborated what victims had described. The defense tried to argue that Vance had been entrapped or framed, that the evidence was planted or misinterpreted, but the sheer volume and consistency of evidence made those arguments absurd. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 43 counts. Vance showed no reaction when the verdicts were read. Rebecca Nolan's trial followed 2 months later. Her defense was that she'd been manipulated by Vance and hadn't understood the extent of what was happening. The prosecution presented emails and text messages showing she'd been fully aware and actively complicit. She was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, both Vance and Nolan were given the maximum sentences allowed. Vance received 75 years in prison. Nolan received 30 years. Neither would ever be eligible for parole. The judge, a woman named Teresa Singh, spoke directly to them before imposing sentences. You both held positions of trust over vulnerable children. You exploited that trust to cause profound harm. Mr. Vance, you systematically abused students for years while presenting yourself as an advocate for children. That level of calculated deception and cruelty warrants the maximum punishment this court can impose. Ms. Nolan, you enabled every instance of abuse by helping Mr. Vance maintain access to victims and covering his activities. You are equally culpable for the harm done to these children. Both of you will spend the rest of your lives in prison. That is the consequence of your choices. Victims and their families sobbed in the courtroom, some with relief, others with the weight of trauma that no prison sentence could truly address. After the sentencing, several victims spoke to media. Sophia was among them, having waived her right to anonymity because she wanted her story to be public. She stood with her foster parents, having been removed from her mother's custody after her mother failed to protect her, and initially sided with Vance. Sophia spoke clearly and calmly. What happened to me and the other victims was terrible, but I want people to know that we survived. We're getting help, we're healing, and we're grateful to the people who believed us and fought for us, especially Mr. Lawson. He saw my journal, and he immediately did something about it. He didn't ignore it or make excuses. He reported it right away. That's what saved me, and probably saved other girls who would have been victimized in the future. I watched her interview from home and cried for the first time since this whole situation began, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief that she was okay, that she was strong, that she'd found her voice. The district hired Dr. Caldwell permanently as superintendent after her successful interim period. She implemented comprehensive reforms including policies requiring all one-on-one meetings between staff and students to occur in rooms with windows or with doors open. She mandated annual training on recognizing grooming behaviors and reporting abuse. She created an independent oversight committee that reviewed complaints about staff conduct and had authority to launch investigations without administrative approval. She also launched a district-wide initiative to support the victims and their families, providing free counseling and creating support groups. The victims who had testified became advocates for other survivors, speaking at schools and community events about the importance of reporting abuse and believing victims. Sophia graduated from high school 4 years after the abuse ended. She'd worked hard to overcome the academic struggles that had made her vulnerable to Vance in the first place. She gave a speech at graduation about resilience and finding strength in the darkest moments. I attended her graduation at her invitation and watched her walk across the stage to receive her diploma. Afterward, she found me in the crowd and hugged me. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for believing what you saw in my journal even though it was easier to pretend you hadn't seen it. You changed my life. I told her she'd changed her own life by being brave enough to write the truth and then brave enough to testify. She smiled. Maybe we both did our part. 5 years after finding the journal, I still teach in the district at Monroe Middle School. I never went back to the site where Lincoln Middle School once stood. The building was demolished, and the land sold to a developer who built a community park there. Some people thought it was inappropriate to build a park on ground where so much harm occurred. Others felt it was fitting to create something for children that was safe and joyful. I understood both perspectives. The scandal fundamentally changed how our district operates. Policies that should have existed all along are now standard practice. Staff training that should have been mandatory for years is now comprehensive and ongoing. The culture of deference to administrators without questioning their authority has been replaced with a culture of vigilance and accountability. But the deepest change wasn't in policies or procedures. It was in awareness. Everyone in the district, from teachers to administrators to board members to parents, now understands that predators hide in plain sight, that trusted positions can be exploited, that abuse often happens under the cover of legitimacy and authority, and that the only way to protect children is to maintain constant vigilance, question what seems off even when it comes from respected sources, and act immediately when warning signs appear. I think about Sophia's journal entry often, the one that started everything. Mr. Lawson doesn't know what Principal Vance does in his office after school. She'd been right. I hadn't known. None of us had known. But once I did know, once I saw evidence that couldn't be ignored, I had a choice. Report it and face whatever consequences came, or look away and let it continue. That choice, in that moment, determined everything that followed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Sophia's backpack had been zipped, if the journal hadn't fallen out, if I hadn't seen my name and read the entry. How many more years would the abuse have continued? How many more victims would there have been? The thought is sickening and humbling. The difference between ongoing abuse and justice came down to a fallen journal and a teacher who chose to act on what he read. That's how fragile protection can be, and how critical it is that when the moment comes, when evidence presents itself, the people who see it choose courage over comfort. Years later, Sophia sent me an invitation to her college graduation. She'd majored in social work and planned to work with trauma survivors. She'd turned her worst experience into purpose, using everything she'd learned to help others navigate their own recovery. I attended the ceremony and watched her receive her degree. Afterward, she introduced me to her fiancé and her foster parents, who'd given her the stable home she'd never had before. She looked healthy and happy and whole in ways that seemed impossible that day in March when I'd found her journal. She pulled me aside before I left. "I wanted you here because you're part of my story. You're the person who chose to see what was happening even when it would have been easier to look away. You didn't know me that well. You could have convinced yourself it wasn't your business or that you'd misunderstood what you read, but you didn't. You acted immediately, and that saved my life. I need you to understand that. You saved my life and the lives of other girls. That matters more than anything else that came from that situation." I thanked her for saying that, for including me in her celebration, for turning her trauma into strength that she'd use to help others. She hugged me and said, "No, thank you, for everything, for being the kind of teacher who actually protects students instead of just claiming to. The world needs more people like you." As I drove home from her graduation, I thought about the cost of discovering what I'd discovered: the end of Lincoln Middle School, the division among staff, the professional consequences for people who'd failed in oversight, the psychological trauma to an entire community, the lawsuit settlements that cost millions. But I also thought about the alternative. If I'd never found that journal, or if I'd found it and chosen to ignore what I'd read, Sophia would still be trapped in abuse. Other girls would have become victims. Vance would have continued for years, maybe decades, harming children with impunity. Sometimes doing the right thing means triggering consequences that seem disproportionate and devastating. Sometimes protecting one child requires tearing down entire systems that failed. And sometimes the hardest part isn't making the initial choice to act, but living with the aftermath of that choice while everyone around you questions whether the destruction was worth it. But standing at Sophia's college graduation, watching her celebrate the future she'd built from the ruins of her trauma, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth it. Every difficult moment, every professional consequence, every sleepless night wondering if I'd done the right thing. It had all been worth it because she was alive and healing and whole, and because the system that had failed her and so many others had been forced to change in ways that would protect future students. That's what justice looks like sometimes. Not clean or simple or without cost, but necessary, essential, worth whatever it takes to achieve. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.